Good morning, everyone. I'm John Stark, and let's get started with the first panel of the Incident Response Forum 2020. This panel is a kickoff panel of experts talking about whatever subjects they believe are important going forward. It's a tradition we have at the forum where we just want to get some of the brightest people we know in the field and just hear what they have to say to start us out. Obviously, COVID-19 is on everyone's mind and its impact, so my guess is they'll be covering a lot of that. Let me do some quick introductions of the panel, and then we're going to get started right away. First off, we have on this panel my friend Heather Egan-Sussman, who is really the Serena Williams of data privacy. With almost 20 years of experience, there is still no stopping her. She is the global co-chair of Oric's Cyber Privacy and Data Innovation Practice and the co-leader of Oric's Boston office. When COVID-19 hit, Heather was right on it. She got to thinking about work from home, and she put together a compendium of U.S. data privacy and securities laws, standards, and frameworks implicated by remote work arrangements. And she created this kind of legal compliance guide with her colleagues. It's really terrific. It's on her website. I'm sure you'll hear a little bit about that today. Heather, we're so glad you could be with us, and I hope all is A-OK in Boston. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Finally, a sunny day in Boston. We're loving it.
Excellent, excellent. Next, moderating the panel is Chris Walina. Chris is the global co-head of Norton Rose Fulbright's Data Protection, Privacy, and Cybersecurity Group. He's perfect for this panel because he has the perspective of an in-house cybersecurity lawyer, having begun his career in privacy as vice president and assistant GC at ChoicePoint, where he ran the company's privacy, compliance, ethics, and credentialing department. He also worked in-house at Dow Chemical and at Bayer. So now Chris does for other companies what he did in-house, which is to manage all incident response workflow during the complete life cycle of an incident response. We're thrilled to have Chris here, especially to start the day off. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, John. And I have locked my children out, so hopefully no kids running by.
Excellent, excellent. Next up, we have Luke Tenery, Senior Managing Director at Anchor Consulting. And this is another thing we try to do with these panels, because what makes Luke so great is that he's not just an incident response talent, but he's a genuine technologist and a certified network penetration tester. He's regularly engaged to ethically compromise the security of client systems and simulate attacker computer intrusion activities. He's leading really a new generation of data breach response specialists who not only manage the investigation of a data security incident, but they stick around and fix it afterwards, not just with better tech, because that's not the answer. The answer is better governance, is really most often better governance. So Luke is really terrific at all that. This is a rare combination we have with Luke. I look forward, especially with Luke, hearing what you're working on as a result of COVID-19. We hope that all is safe and healthy for you in Chicago. Welcome, Luke.
Thanks, John. Really happy to be here. Privileged again to be working with you guys at the forum.
Excellent. And finally, we have someone, Lars McCarter. And Lars is at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. On every panel of the forum, we try to have a government participant to provide a bona fide law enforcement or regulatory perspective. And today we've got people from the FBI, from the Secret Service, Homeland Security, Federal Trade Commission. I'm sure I'm missing some. So we try to bring them into each panel to give you some perspective. And I know this is an agency that most of our audience probably hasn't heard before, this Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, which is part of Homeland Security. That's because the agency is not even 2 years old. From what I can tell, it essentially serves as the nation's chief risk officer, working with partners to defend against today's threats and collaborating to build more secure and resilient infrastructure for the future. What makes Lars McCarter so great for this panel is really his title. He's got the best title of anyone at the Incident Response Forum. His title is Threat Hunter. So welcome, Lars, and thank you for helping keep us all safe.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Walina. Chris, why don't you go ahead, and then I'm going to leave this panel and get meeting with the next one to keep things moving. So thanks, everyone, and good luck with this panel.
Thanks so much, John. Appreciate it. And we have a great panel, as you just heard. We've got three unique perspectives. We thought we would talk about big issues going forward. You're going to hear about current landscape as well that we're seeing. But also, really, we're going to focus on what we think is coming in the near term. We've got a top forensic investigator in the field, as you've heard, a top private practitioner in Heather, talking about legal and regulatory landscape and what's coming down the pipeline. And also, as you heard, we've got Lars, who's a national security expert, who's going to bring that perspective. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Luke. And Luke, just to get you started, obviously, COVID's on everybody's mind. We're here, obviously, in this forum. I think we've all spent some time talking, obviously, leading up to this panel, and I think all of us have the same view that there has been a surge in cybersecurity incidents, both in attempts and successes. It's been pretty amazing in all of our practices, hearing from everyone just how much the surge in activity has been. In addition to what you're seeing, Lars, since quarantine, talk about the threat landscape today, what you're seeing, and also, of course, talk about where you think things are headed in the future.
Thanks, Chris. Pleasure to speak here. A lot of questions packed into that, and I'll do my best to kind of give you a little bit about what we're seeing, and then a little bit about where we think things are going. But this is crisis, and I wouldn't be a good Chicagoan, or at least adopted Chicagoan, if I didn't make the kind of obligatory link between Chicago politicians and a crisis not going to waste. Is oftentimes an introductory point of mine, but I would say that the attackers are, at least in this era of COVID, definitely being opportunistic in that sense. But I'll also say that we try to be studies of the past. Most really good incident responders are aware of lessons learned and case study. We take those things seriously at Ankara. And in some ways, the veneer of aspects of attackers being opportunistic right now is very similar to what we've seen in the past. So there's elements of just like the plague that hit Madagascar, the Ebola outbreak, the swine flu in 2009, and prior to that, in the early 2000s with SARS. We've seen pretty consistent similarities in terms of the scam or the initial kind of layer to the broader tip of the iceberg in terms of attackers taking advantage of some of the chaos that at some level goes direct to consumers and trying to elicit fraud, and then other aspects in more sophisticated ways. Really sophisticated attack groups are leveraging as well. I would say there's other similarities too, that some are less thought of, and some of the other drivers related to downstream effects of COVID. Some of the economic impacts are very similar to the economic downturn, and we're already seeing certain aspects of cyber actors or nefarious activity related to the economic downturn, and I think we'll see some continued similarities with that I know Lars may also cover from an attack group, and how some of the history will repeat itself there. But I think one of the newer aspects is sort of amplified is, one of my other panelists said this in the prep, but some of the accepted risk that we're going through as a result of this mass transformation of technology in such a short period of time. Some of it is actually just existing platforms for, the platform that we're on here with Zoom and greater adoption of that, other collaboration platforms in the cloud. But this mass transformation of aspects of the workforce that haven't been heavily acclimated to doing all those things remotely, I think we're going to continue to see, and maybe even a delay in terms of some of the at least recognized attacks on some of the services, just given how pulled in a number of different directions resources are right now. So ultimately, a lot of things we've seen before, but just a different amalgamation of of what the attacks look like. But in terms of real time information, in terms of what our clients are experiencing and other issues that we're monitoring from a threat intelligence perspective, which is a lot of what we leverage at ANCRA to be situationally aware, be plugged in with the communities, but also continuously monitor with the endpoints that we have under management for our clients, but also the existential lookouts that we do for our clients too, for monitoring different deep dark web searches. We're kind of taking all that, centralizing it, and trying to make sense of it to better protect our clients, but also just be as aware as possible as we move forward, which we found situational awareness to kind of be a real significant differentiator for us during these times. But with some of that, I'll transition into some of the impacts that we're seeing. Alert levels at some level we're already at all-time highs, and in few times have there been such great awareness and readiness, particularly in this community assembled here, but in the broader cybersecurity community as well. The Iranian threat actually in January really kind of put a number of alerts into place. A number of government regulators issued guidance around some of the Iranian tensions and some of the cyber threat activity there, particularly for disruptive or business interruption related attacks. But ultimately, the community was actually at a pretty solid posture for resiliency in times like this. And I'll say that just from a visibility standpoint, in terms of what's going on, the right preventative measures, active defenses is sort of a key term in some of that. Organizations were, at least those that were heavily invested and cyber aware, were really well positioned heading into these times. But I will say, though, the actors have been opportunistic. We know that they've shifted their focus in many ways. They're looking at organizations, an example, that have essential duties. So kind of think not just supply chains, but supply chains or shipping operations to critical infrastructure related resources organizations, or even defense contractors and some of the supply chains to them. We've seen those organizations not just impacted by disruptive or destructive attacks, but consistently probed as well. The actors are aware that organizations are going through this mass transformation of technology and remote workforce, so they're probing those areas.
Hey, Luke. I've got a couple of specific questions. By the way, I should have said but it's good to see questions already coming in. Please keep sending questions along, because we wanted this to be as much a dialogue as we could manage in a short period of time in this format. But getting some specific questions, Luke, some specific questions with this remote issue. So one question is how do we ensure specific protections on specific router settings and remote security protocols, Wi-Fi, et cetera, like any best practices on that sort of thing in dealing with remote access and dealing with clients, dealing with sensitive information, that sort of stuff. And relatedly, getting a question about, in the health space and dealing with HIPAA related data and consulting and that sort of thing on FaceTime, WhatsApp, videos, Zoom, like we are here, with making sure sessions aren't recorded and that sort of stuff. So anyway, a broad question for you, Luke, but any specific type of security recommendations on all this remote stuff?
Yeah, I would say for starters, for technology or security leaders, I think some of it's just starting with policy that's really well rooted in fundamentals for remote access. So some of that is working with corporate only assigned devices if possible, or basically creating sort of virtual resources or kind of secure remote desktops. Anyone who's been a responder on this conference knows they probably already kind of did that gasp in terms of, oh, please don't turn on RDP more for our clients, because we know that's a point of entry. But What I am saying is that, organizations should take protections or precautions to really double down on some of their remote access options and hardening those, but also developing some policy around their organizations and users that have gone remote. So really, it's kind of FAQs and checklists and making sure organizations or employees are going through some of the fundamentals there. But generally, if possible, deploying your own assets, leveraging utilities such as multi-factor authentication, VPN, and really kind of just revisiting, making sure all the seat belts are kind of set and clasped as they hop into the other vehicles that they're driving to work remotely. And I think some of it's also just adapting that with some of these new platforms, revisiting those across Microsoft 365 or whatever the other collaborative platforms are, and building in the right levels of security protections, policy. These platforms haven't just changed overnight. It's just the adoption and growth, I think, that is, stayed ahead of their organization's ability to secure that. And so, ultimately, we're seeing now that organizations are finally catching up over the last few weeks. But I think there's part of that. And then you mentioned, Chris, aspects of the consumer side. And, we have seen a few alerts recently in terms of certain attack groups going after people's home routers. I mean, some of it's just, kind of the same as the IoT phenomenon, where there's more technology, there's going to be more vulnerabilities. So unfortunately, it's people kind of locking those down, patching them, making sure the vulnerabilities are up to date, and going through some of those fundamentals. But hopefully, with corporate IT assets, there's enough kind of protections and enclave that, whatever nasties your kids are picking up, streaming or whatever other online social work that they're doing, you're enough portioned off with the robust security capabilities of the modern remote user that more or less we're seeing good protections there actually through some of those things.
Hey, Luke, real quick before we shift to Heather, and you'll have to hit this quickly though. In terms of going forward, big issues. We talked a little bit about cloud incident response is tricky for all of us. We talked about that, and specific vulnerabilities just seem to keep popping up. Hardware vulnerabilities, which provides a whole nother set of challenges for folks. What do you see on the horizon in terms of from a technical standpoint, the challenges from your chair?
Sure. Clouds definitely continue to pick up for us, whether it's kind of SaaS platforms like Microsoft 365 or more on the infrastructure side between AWS and Azure. Significant growth there. But I would say, some of the new twist on that is, and really security has become a bit of a big data issue, or I'm hesitant to call it a big data problem. But the swaths of data that we're analyzing now, whether it's a Databricks data lake in Azure, and our clients needed to, are pushing their log information there, or mining through, a significant amount of mailboxes in a BEC for PII. A lot of those, we've just seen the proliferation of those problems move from the infrastructure to the cloud. But ultimately, there's some advantages to those issues, but they are continuing to grow. We're leveraging data science and data analytics more than we ever have to solve some of these problems for our clients. And I think you'll continue to see that emerge as a trend with the overlay of what we call threat analytics, or it's basically taking threat intelligence married with some data analytics to solve some of the problems around data exposures, confirming actor activity, and those sorts of things. I think you'll continue to see some of that. I think some of the other kind of slight twists to what we're seeing are, extortion, ransomware is here, but we're seeing a new edge on that in terms of, actually exfiltrating the data and holding up ransoms in the event they're not paid. The Maze ransomware and other things I know will be covered probably later. But ultimately, extortion is kind of hitting a new level of extremes. We're leveraging threat intelligence to give our clients better visibility into those data exposures released by attack groups, as well as understanding the reputations of bug bounties as well to help protect our clients. So I think situational awareness married with some of the deeper analytics is definitely going to be a continued trend. And if I had to just sort of forecast something else, I would say AI is going to continue to merge as a relevant piece in terms of, kind of looking at cloud almost as a case study now. It's still being adopted. There's still issues there. AI will have some vulnerabilities and or, uncertainties, unknowns about it. We, not just as a solution to solving security problems, but AI, I think, because of some of the regulatory impacts, issues that it overlays with privacy, and which I think Heather could probably talk to or speak to.
And that's what I was just going to say, Heather. I mean, I'm going to shift to you from your field, cybersecurity, incident response, privacy. As a lawyer, what big issues going forward from your standpoint? I'm sure a lot of what was just spoke resonated with you, but please give us your thoughts.
It really did. So much of what Luke said, I can cover the legal angle, but so for example, ransomware, we've seen a few cases where companies went through a cyber attack and after investigation and remediation, backdoors were not identified or not properly cleaned for whatever reason. And years later, those backdoors can be reactivated, whether offered for rent or used by the same threat actor to launch a second attack. And to my mind, this really underscores the need to focus on remediation following an incident. And I'd like to see more outside counsel taking even more of an active role in overseeing this part of the incident response, because too often it's left to the company IT, but they're already so overworked or under the gun. And unless there's clear project management, oversight, some mechanism for ongoing monitoring and review, that work is often left incomplete. And I think things can and do fall through the cracks. It's definitely best if you have whatever you've done blessed by the outside forensic firm, but that kind of remediation is typically covered by cyber policies. So I do think that there's really making it a point to factor that into the daily forensic calls when we've got the company side, the forensic provider, and the legal counsel all agreeing on, on the remediation plan of action, and then the teams go back and execute. Then you have a process in place for making sure the plan was actually executed properly, a checks and balances. Well, that's if you have one provider, because I think another thing we heard from Luke is that a big trend I'm seeing is more and more cases where you have several outside firms performing different functions. So that's really where coordination becomes even more important. And that's a role that outside counsel can serve certainly in incident response. Another trend going forward is the continued proliferation of notification laws around.
Hey, Heather, before you go to the laws, because you hit on something. We were talking about this, and I just thought you should hit it a little bit more, because you and I were saying, it sure seems like there are an awful lot more third parties involved in these incidents and managing. So from a lawyer, from your chair, like from a legal perspective, how do you manage all those third parties? And some of them we try to engage under privilege. Others are running around. Next thing you know, you find a party that you didn't even know was there, who hands you a report. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you're managing that?
Well, I think you do need to quickly, when coming into an incident, get your arms around all parties that are involved and, to the best extent possible, directly engage those providers through the outside counsel so that the work is being performed at the direction of counsel for purposes of allowing counsel to inform and provide legal advice to the client. That's really the way to ultimately protect those reports. But it's all about coordination. I think those daily forensic calls, bringing the teams to the table is so key. But we're also seeing more incidents involving service providers where we may be representing a client whose service provider has had the breach. And that's where we can't emphasize enough how important it is to have good contracting mechanisms in place that really dictate what's going to happen in the event of a security incident. So that, especially as we're seeing a continued trend of proliferation of notification laws around the globe, it can be a challenge to try to determine what are your notification obligations when you don't have your hands on the underlying data and you're not controlling the investigation. But those notification laws we're seeing for both privacy and cybersecurity incidents. So the issue of jurisdiction, I think, can be a challenging one and potentially lead to some messy fights. Now, if you're a technology company with users around the world, for example, even if you don't have operations in country, we're actually seeing more non-US regulators seeking to assert jurisdiction and want notification of any breach involving their residents, regardless of where the breach takes place. In most cases, you're going to have good arguments on jurisdiction, but you often have to weigh the cost benefit of making those arguments. And when these jurisdictions also have a 72-hour notification period, things have to happen very quickly with potentially high stakes. I think companies are really wise to update their incident response plans to give some thought to how to handle these more difficult jurisdictions, especially if you're operating where you have customers or information that's gathered from around the world. Turkey is a great example. In their view, any breach involving a Turkish resident should be notified. Any breach. And there are lots of reasons you may want to avoid notifying in Turkey, or you may want to appease the regulator and just file within the 72 hours as a courtesy, even if you think you have a good jurisdictional challenge. But beware, Turkey will publish your notice. It's remarkable. There's not a lot of other jurisdictions that will do that. And they'll publish it either the same day or the day after that you've submitted it, potentially preempting your notices in other jurisdictions. So just be sure to factor that in to whatever you decide to disclose to that regulator, and definitely factor that into your media plan. Another future trend, and I think Luke really touched on this too, is that I think we'll be talking about this more at next year's Incident Response Forum, is the investigation, remediation, and notification of privacy incidents as opposed to just cyber incidents. So I was saying to Chris and Luke, you before, that this panel, that I'm surprised we haven't seen more forensic providers retooling their marketing materials to tout their ability to investigate privacy incidents, those AI and data-related incidents that you mentioned, Luke, in addition to cyber ones. For a privacy breach, the alleged misuse of personal information by a company that otherwise may have authorization to possess it, or the overcollection of information, or wrongful destruction or retention, these cases are leading to real fines around the world. And I think it's not going to be very long until we see that here in the US with a private right of action for privacy breaches pursuant to state law. California, for example, has put the private right of action on ice, but I think we're all predicting this will be back on the table soon enough. And a privacy incident is a very different lens through which to conduct a forensic review, but with CCPA-style remedies and a private right of action, potentially far more costly to the company in terms of litigation. So for any forensic firms that are looking for their next big thing in 2021, there you have it. The last thing I did want to touch on, a COVID-related issue, Chris, if I have time, was the subject of my One Big Thing video, and that the COVID virus is not going away anytime soon, but at some point we're going to have to get back in the office. And for essential businesses, they're already there. OSHA's general duty clause requires employers to provide employees with a work site that is free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Incident response professionals can and should use their IR skills to build an infection response plan to help demonstrate that the company is taking reasonable steps to manage reports of infection or exposure. What would this look like? Well, you could actually take your incident response plan and basically retool it to work in this context, creating a policy that requires employees to notify the employer when they've been exposed or they have symptoms. You'd define that as a health report, right? You'd have to determine what would qualify as exposure, what does qualify as symptoms. And if you define that as a health report, set up a process to receive and respond to those health reports. There can be an investigation, for example. You consider contact tracing. Are you using technology to determine where that worker moved and who they may have come in contact with? How far back do you go? What remediation activities might you undertake? For example, cleaning, disinfection. And then a process for notification to OSHA in certain circumstances, or perhaps to other employees, impacted contractors or partners. And you can even have a procedure for a postmortem. Well, I actually might use that term in incident response, but may not be appropriate in the pandemic context. But if you track through the life cycle of an infection and treat it like you would a cyber incident, you can spin up an effective plan to work through with key stakeholders and even tabletop your plan. I think this is going to be the new normal for a while.
Heather, two questions I want you to hit quickly, if you can, that have come in. We already talked a little bit about it, but I just want to go back to it because it goes to that point that we're talking about so many third parties and incident response. The question was, there's a lot of guidance out there and a lot of sort of playbooks out there for handling when you've been breached, but not so much when your vendor has been breached in terms of, impacting your business and your vendors. And, we're dealing with an incident right now where a, service provider was impacted, and that brings all sorts of issues. So number one, anything to talk about in terms of what to do if your vendor is breached. As you know, Heather, the contract isn't always the thing, right? So number one, any tips on if your vendor is breached and your business is impacted? And number two, and you're going to love this question, which is who do you call first? Lawyer, insurer, service provider, forensic provider, law enforcement. Who do you call first? That's easy. Right? So Heather, those two questions.
So, in thinking about how to manage the service provider breach, I always say, as soon as we come onto an incident, I've got 3 immediate work streams. Work stream number 1 is you're stopping the bleeding. You're trying to make sure that the attacker is out. You're closing those back doors. You're addressing and remediating, again, stopping the bleeding. The second work stream, you're trying to retrace the threat actor's activities. Where did they go? What did they touch? Was there any access or exfiltration of personal information, whatever that term may be, that is going to trigger a legal obligation for the company? You have to quickly figure out what that is. The third work stream then is from that second work stream, once you identify the attacker's roadmap, what are the legal obligations? And you're sometimes trying to do that very quickly because you've got the 72-hour notification period. Now take that in the service provider context, right? You're not in control of the first work stream. The second work stream you're also not in control of, but you can still be asking those questions of the service provider. Let's put us on the phone with your forensic provider, and I would be walking through the same sets of questions that I would be walking if the provider was our own. There can be some challenges there, some issues of privilege, and so I would punt to our litigators who are covering on a later panel today to talk through some of those common interest and joint defense considerations for purposes of shoring up and maintaining the privileged nature of the investigation. But it doesn't change the fact that it's the company ultimately that still has the notification obligation. And so I think as quickly as possible, trying to get information back. Was there exfiltration? Was there unauthorized access? What did that look like? And from the moment you receive that information is when the notification clock typically starts running for you around the world. And as to who do you call first, just given that level of complexity, bringing in an outside counsel who can quickly quarterback that for you. And then, of course, also putting your carrier and getting the forensic firm in the door as quickly as possible to be your second opinion is key.
Even Luke would say, call your lawyer first. Lars, let's shift to, national security is kind of an important thing, I think. And coming from somebody who sits in a shop that's rather large, where national security is your mission, give us your perspective. What current landscape, future? Have at it.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. So I think Luke did a really good job of kind of, laying out kind of the current threat landscape as it exists today. There's certainly uptick in activity across the board, and we see that here in CISA in the larger department as well. But I would say more broadly, not just from national security perspective, but more from national resiliency perspective, we have an opportunity to look at what's happening and apply a lot of lessons learned to this. So, teeing off of, hey, what do we do, or how do we prep for an incident? That's obviously a larger thing that you do in conjunction with business continuity as a whole, or COOP for us inside of government. But we're going to be doing the same things that I hope you all will be doing at the end of this or through this as we progress. What are those things as we do more distributed remote working, as we're learning how to secure our data wherever our data goes, since the old boundaries are really no longer exist. The data is outside of our castle walls. So that's a different landscape than it was probably 5-10 years ago. So how do you build your plans based on that, given everything that you need to do in the private sector in terms of, your legal requirements during a breach, et cetera, which I'm certainly not an expert of or in, but I can tell everyone that this is a great opportunity to work on that incident response plan. So do you have one, right, is kind of the first thing. Those are questions that we get asked, or that we ask immediately when someone calls CISA for help or requests an incident response assistance. And I'll talk about CISA services at the end briefly. But hey, is that plan robust? Does it talk to all of the partners that you need inside of your organization and externally? Do you know if you've determine that you have to engage law enforcement? Do you know which law enforcement entity to reach out to? Those are questions that you should probably be asking yourselves well ahead of time if you don't already have those identified. In the context of everything that's going on, right? How do you respond to breaches in this new distributed environment? If you have an organic IR team, are they prepped to work remotely? Do they have to go on site? If they have to go on site, do they have what they might need in whatever facilities they need to get to? And that could be a challenge. Transportation, logistics, all of these things are complicated, but they're kind of basic questions. But the basic stuff is often what gets us in the incident response world. So the more that you can kind of plan these out, map these out on the exercise perspective, that goes towards our goal of increased national resiliency across the board, all sectors, critical infrastructure or those that are not necessarily critical in nature. So take time now while we're going through this and ask yourself those questions. More towards kind of the remote world, in business continuity in general, do you have all the pieces that you need to push these people out remotely? If you do, or if you don't, how are you going to get them? It's another great way. This is pushing us forward, I should say, on the IT services front. For a lot of companies, I would imagine people are doing more migrations now than they probably had planned to in the past, which can be a good thing. But sometimes we break through boundaries a little haphazardly. So, it's our job to kind of guide that into the new world, so to speak, of us working from Zoom and MS Teams and all those other great things. Before I transition into kind of a quick discussion on CISA services and some of the things on information sharing, I don't know if there's any questions, but I did want to pause real briefly. If not, I'll keep pressing forward on some of the public-private partnership information sharing.
No, I think it would be good for you to get into that, Lars, because from our standpoint, and Heather is the same. I know our clients are often wondering the benefits of sharing, the issues with sharing, and how DHS can help in incident response.
Yeah. So CISA is most of it. Most people remember the old U.S. CERT construct, and then it became the NCIC, and the NCIC was kind of consumed in a reorganization when CISA as an agency was created through legislation very recently. So it is a very new organization. Existing people just kind of reorged. But information sharing on the public-private front with CISA particularly is very important, right? We want to know when incidents occur in the private space to the greatest extent possible. And whether we can help or whether we can share that information inside of the federal government or inside of the entities that we're authorized to share it with for kind of broad awareness. Again, that national resiliency perspective. That's not always going to be desired. Certainly, an organization might decide, hey, we don't want to work with the government. We don't want to share with the government. And there's certain reasons for that, and we understand. However, we would strive for you to report that incident to the watches. You can find them on just Googling, the old US CERT, phone number or whatever, letting them know. And that might be part of your legal calculus. The other thing is that avenue brings to you is it brings the services of CISA to up in case you need them. So we deploy hunt and incident response teams to certain elements in the private sector at their request to help do that mitigation. We certainly don't compete with third-party IR firms. They do their thing. We do this from the federal government perspective. In many cases, it might make the most sense for an organization to go with a third-party firm. Sometimes, though, there might be cost issues. There might be other things. This might be something particularly interesting to the government. Hey, we're seeing threads of similarities across these types of incidents that if you bring it to us, we might be able to help you better. We can help interface.
And Lars, you work side by side with forensic firms, right? So, I mean, it's not like you come in and replace.
Correct. Right. So our teams typically, when they go out to provide advice, say there's a known incident and they're working on an incident response on site with the customer, they're not actually going to mitigate that problem our team is not going to do that. We're not going to necessarily onboard that risk, but we will help identify. I mean, we'll come in and we'll deploy systems to your network, et cetera, but we're not going to take actions that are likely to potentially put the organization at risk without them being aware. And that's where third-party firms come in. So there absolutely is a working relationship. Oftentimes, law enforcement's engaged in that conversation. So it's another option for everyone in the private sector to potentially look to, especially if they don't know what to do. And I would say, particularly smaller firms that might not already have that kind of stuff mapped out, there's no harm in, I would say, calling and reporting and asking for help, so to speak. But beyond just the normal incident response, the key of sharing, not just, hey, we let you know, or you let us know that an incident or a breach has occurred, is that allows us to aggregate information, right, with law enforcement entities, the intelligence community, and put out those types of products that we do, kind of those broad-based guidance pieces that you might see on the websites, or we distribute from the national level to kind of give everybody the latest trends on what we're seeing inside of government, right? So the more that we share back and forth and we get comfortable with that, and of course, in an anonymized way, right? I think that's key. At no point is it ever going to take a report of an incident from an entity and then republish that name. Sometimes certain things slip in various scenarios, but generally speaking, the guiding principle is that every piece of information that we get is anonymized. It may or may not be shared internally with other agencies, but that information is not going to go out on the street. We do not want any kind of business harm or impacts to you all in the public space from that.
By the way, look, that's really important. I mean, I think most of other, and you've just said a lot of really important things. I mean, the sharing issue, the confidentiality issue. I mean, this is what we have in the U.S. is unique in with DHS and FBI, Secret Service, and it is not the case, as Heather will tell you as well, that it's not the case across the globe. Certainly in the EU, I think we see similar type of confidentiality and sensitivities to corporations, but that's not the case necessarily in every part of the world. I think we have a unique thing here in the U.S. and in other parts of the area too, but it's not all created equal. Heather, a question I want to ping over to you. This relates to you and your clients sharing information with Lars. Privilege obviously is an issue, right? Obviously in investigations, but you want and a lot of times need government to participate. You need DHS help, FBI help. How do you structure that? The question came into how do you structure that to preserve privilege, which is a little different because obviously when you're sharing with law enforcement, then but just any thoughts on that aspect of things and how do you make it work?
Well, I think it's frustrating that there is no law enforcement privilege, extension of privilege that's recognized currently, and I think that there should be. I will punt this a little bit to say that the Sedona Conference has been working. Group 11 has released an excellent white paper that details the law in this area and recommends a few pathways forward, because I do think that it is such an important function. And much like what we see in the FAA context here in the United States, when you have a plane crash, there's the ability for people to come in and say, what is it that happened? Let's work together against what could be a common threat to public safety. We don't have that same thing in the data security context, and we should. Companies should be treated more like victims who are experiencing these incidents and allowed to cooperate with law enforcement without then turning themselves over to scrutiny or persecution by plaintiff's bar or by regulators. So that's my 2 cents from the peanut gallery. And
no, that's great. And Lars, back to you. You share with other agencies, right? FBI. How does that look? A question came in asking that sort of.
Yeah, so it really depends on the situation, Chris, and it's different between, for example, sharing of an incident versus other types of information where there's vulnerabilities, that type of thing, which is on a different side of CISA. But depending on the situation, we may or may not share with the law enforcement entities or the intelligence community writ large. I will tell you, they certainly share with us, which is a good thing, generally speaking. Absent the kind of legal hole that we have in terms of Heather was just addressing, we get a lot of good information from our intelligence community as it pertains to breaches, and so that results in sometimes, hey, we're able to notify people that something has happened that they might have never otherwise heard about, and that's a win. That's a win for national resiliency. That's a win for the organization. That's a win for the intelligence community. That's a win for CISA. So that type of sharing, we want to continue. However, it has to be done very carefully in terms of the anonymization, right? So again, we don't want identities to be released. So we're very careful about that. That's a significant precaution that we take, whether we're sharing with law enforcement or intelligence community individuals, or I should say organizations, to make sure that information is anonymized.
Well, Bruce, I see you, and we're getting some really good questions coming in. So are we done?
We are done. Chris, thank you so much, and great job by the first panel. Kicked us off so strong. Got a lot of great questions. I hope the audience will continue to give us questions, because it really makes the day interesting. Heather, I'm jealous of wherever you claim to be right now. You look great. But let's say our next panel is on counseling boards and C-suite before the inevitable breach. It starts in 5 minutes. So we'll see y'all back here at 9:20 Eastern. And again, to our first panel, thank you so much. Great job.